Welcome to The Political Bridge, the podcast dedicated to fostering informed discussion across the political spectrum. I'm your host, Ada, and today we're tackling one of the most complex and persistent foreign policy challenges, the future of U.S.-Iran relations. For decades, this relationship has been marked by mistrust, proxy conflicts, and a nuclear standoff. The approaches have varied, from diplomatic engagement to crippling sanctions, each with its proponents and detractors. With President Trump's administration continuing to navigate this intricate landscape, the debate over the most effective path forward, diplomacy or sanctions, is more critical than ever. We'll explore the core arguments for each strategy, examining their historical efficacy, potential risks, and their implications for regional stability and global security. Joining me to dissect this vital issue are our resident political analysts, Nico and Jordan. Nico, Jordan, welcome back to the bridge.
Thanks, Ada. When we look at U.S.-Iran relations, the evidence overwhelmingly supports a sanctions-first approach. History shows that the Iranian regime responds to pressure, not appeasement. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, under former President Biden's administration, offered significant concessions for temporary nuclear limitations. Yet Iran continued its malign activities, funding proxies and developing ballistic missiles. President Trump's strategy of maximum pressure through robust sanctions has demonstrably weakened Iran's economy, reducing its ability to fund these destabilizing actions. Iran's oil exports plummeted from over 2.5 million barrels per day in 2018 to less than 300,000 in 2020. This economic strain creates leverage. Diplomacy without overwhelming pressure is often perceived as weakness by authoritarian regimes. Sanctions compel them to the negotiating table from a position of disadvantage, forcing real concessions rather than superficial agreements. It's about protecting American interests and regional allies by curbing Iran's dangerous ambitions.
Thank you, Ada. Nico's perspective overlooks the critical failures and unintended consequences of a sanctions-heavy approach. While sanctions aim to compel, they often inflict severe hardship on ordinary Iranian citizens, fueling anti-American sentiment and strengthening hardliners who can blame external pressures for domestic woes. The maximum pressure campaign, for instance, saw Iran accelerate its nuclear program beyond JCPOA limits after the U.S. withdrawal, enriching uranium to 60% purity, a level far closer to weapons grade than before. This demonstrates that sanctions can backfire, pushing Iran further into isolation and making it less transparent. True peace and stability require sustained direct diplomatic engagement, as seen in the initial stages of the JCPOA negotiations. Sanctions alone have never fundamentally altered the regime's behavior. They only exacerbate tensions. We need to create pathways for de-escalation and mutual understanding, not just economic strangulation that risks regional conflict and emboldens those who reject dialogue entirely.
Both of you have laid out compelling initial argument. Nico, you emphasize sanctions as a necessary tool for leverage, citing the JCPOA's perceived failures and the impact of maximum pressure. Jordan, you highlight the humanitarian cost and the risk of escalation, advocating for diplomacy as a more sustainable path. My first follow-up question to both of you is this. How do you reconcile the undeniable economic impact of sanctions with the observable fact that Iran has at times accelerated its nuclear program or increased regional proxy activity in response to heightened pressure? Is there a point where sanctions become counterproductive, or is escalation an inherent risk of any robust foreign policy?
That's a crucial question, Ada. The acceleration of Iran's nuclear program post-JCPOA withdrawal wasn't a failure of sanctions, but a predictable, albeit regrettable, tactic by a regime testing international resolve. Iran's enrichment to 60% is a dangerous gambit, but it's also a desperate attempt to gain leverage for future negotiations, knowing its economy is struggling. The key is to maintain and intensify pressure, not to capitulate. Consider North Korea. Decades of on-again, off-again diplomacy and sanctions have shown that consistency in pressure is vital. When the regime feels truly cornered, that's when genuine shifts can occur. The alternative, easing sanctions without fundamental behavioral change, only emboldens them. The economic impact is indeed severe for the Iranian people, which is tragic, but it's a direct consequence of their regime's choices. Our goal isn't to punish the people, but to compel the regime to cease its destabilizing actions, and that requires sustained, unwavering pressure, even if it means temporary escalations.
Nico, to suggest Iran's nuclear acceleration is merely a tactic and not a direct, dangerous consequence of sanctions is to ignore reality. When the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA, a deal Iran was largely complying with, according to IAEA reports, it removed the very incentive structure that was containing their nuclear ambitions. The regime's subsequent actions, while concerning, were a predictable response to perceived betrayal and increased hostility. This isn't about capitulation, it's about understanding cause and effect. Sanctions, when applied without a clear diplomatic off-ramp, often lead to a siege mentality, where the regime prioritizes self-reliance and defiance over cooperation. We saw this with Cuba, and we're seeing it again with Iran. This cycle of escalation makes regional conflict more likely, not less. Diplomacy offers a structured way to manage these escalations, providing a framework for de-escalation and verifiable compliance, which sanctions alone cannot achieve. The human cost and the increased risk of war are simply too high to ignore.
This brings us to the stress test. Nico, your argument hinges on the idea that sanctions create leverage for future negotiations. However, you haven't fully addressed how to prevent this leverage from simply pushing Iran towards greater nuclear opacity and regional destabilization, rather than genuine, verifiable concessions. Specifically, how do you ensure that maximum pressure doesn't just encourage Iran to develop its nuclear program in secret, or escalate proxy conflicts as a form of asymmetric retaliation, thereby making a diplomatic resolution even harder? Jordan, your argument for diplomacy emphasizes de-escalation and mutual understanding. Yet, you haven't fully explained how to ensure a diplomatic approach effectively constrains a regime that has a documented history of non-compliance and regional aggression, even when engaged in dialogue. How do you prevent diplomacy from being exploited by Iran to buy time or extract concessions without truly hurting its fundamental destabilizing policies?
Ada, you've hit on a critical point about the risks of opacity and asymmetric retaliation. It's true that any authoritarian regime, when pressured, might seek to operate in the shadows. However, the international community, led by the U.S., has robust intelligence capabilities and monitoring mechanisms. The goal of maximum pressure isn't to eliminate all Iranian activity overnight, but to degrade its capacity and force a strategic recalculation. When Iran's economy is severely constrained, its ability to fund clandestine nuclear work or its proxy networks is significantly hampered. We've seen evidence of this in reduced funding for groups like Hezbollah. The risk of secret development is always present, but it's a risk that exists with or without sanctions. The difference is that sanctions make it harder and more expensive for Iran to pursue such paths. Furthermore, the threat of military action remains a critical, though undesirable, backstop. Sanctions are not a standalone solution. They are part of a broader strategy that includes deterrence and ultimately a pathway to negotiations from a position of strength, where verifiable compliance is non-negotiable.
Ada, that's a fair challenge regarding Iran's history of non-compliance. My argument isn't for diplomacy without accountability, but for diplomacy as the primary, most effective tool for achieving verifiable constraints. The JCPOA, despite its flaws, was a testament to this. It provided the most intrusive inspection regime in history, significantly rolling back Iran's nuclear program. When the U.S. withdrew, those inspections were curtailed and Iran's program advanced. This demonstrates that diplomacy, backed by multilateral consensus and robust verification mechanisms, is far more effective than unilateral pressure. To prevent exploitation, diplomacy must be comprehensive, addressing not just the nuclear issue, but also regional security concerns and human rights, with clear benchmarks and consequences for non-compliance. It requires patience and a willingness to engage, even with adversaries. The alternative, endless sanctions and escalating tensions, has consistently failed to fundamentally alter the regime's behavior and only increases the risk of a military confrontation, which would be catastrophic for the region and global stability. We must offer a credible path to normalize relations if Iran meets its obligations.
The stress test truly highlighted the core tension here: how to apply pressure effectively without inadvertently fueling the very behaviors we seek to curb, and how to engage diplomatically without appearing to legitimize or empower a regime with a problematic track record. Both sides face the challenge of balancing immediate strategic goals with long-term stability, and the difficulty of predicting an adversary's response to either carrot or stick.
Ultimately, the U.S. must prioritize its national security and the security of its allies. Diplomacy is a tool, but it must be wielded from a position of strength, not as a concession. The maximum pressure cane under President Trump has demonstrated that economic leverage is the most effective means to bring Iran to the negotiating table on terms favorable to the U.S. While there are risks of escalation, the greater risk lies in allowing Iran to develop nuclear weapons or further destabilize the Middle East with impunity. Weakening their financial capacity directly impacts their ability to fund these malign activities. Any future diplomatic engagement must be predicated on Iran making fundamental changes to its behavior, not just temporary pauses in its nuclear program. Sanctions provide the necessary impetus for those changes. Without that sustained pressure, any diplomatic overture risks becoming another opportunity for the regime to consolidate power and advance its dangerous agenda, as we saw with the JCPOA. Strength and resolve are paramount.
Nico's argument for strength often translates to a rigid, confrontational stance that has historically failed to achieve lasting peace with Iran. The most effective way to secure U.S. interests and regional stability is through sustained multilateral diplomacy that includes incentives as well as disincentives. The JCPOA, while imperfect, proved that a diplomatic framework can effectively contain Iran's nuclear program under robust international verification. The current administration should learn from the past. Unilateral sanctions, while impactful, is the only sustainable way to prevent war and achieve a long-term resolution, rather than perpetuating a cycle of tension and distrust.
And that brings us to the close of another insightful discussion on the political bridge. We've explored the complex arguments for both sanctions and diplomacy in shaping U.S.-Iran relations, delving into their historical impacts, inherent risks, and potential for achieving peace. It's clear that there are no easy answers, and both approaches present significant challenges and opportunities for the current administration. Thank you, Nico and Jordan, for your thoughtful contributions to this vital debate, and thank you to our listeners for joining us. You can find more information and resources at tpbridgepod.com. Join us next time for another engaging discussion. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep bridging those political divides.